You are listening to Lighthearted, the official podcast of the United States Lighthouse Society. My name is Jeremy D'Entremont. Welcome. My co-host today is Michelle Jewel Shaw, chairperson of Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Jeremy, and hello to all of our listeners out there.
This is episode 109 of Lighthearted, scheduled for March 14th, 2021. Astronomical spring officially begins at the equinox, which will occur next Saturday, March 20th at 5:37 a.m. Meteorological spring supposedly started a couple of weeks ago. How was your winter, Michelle?
It was pretty good. I love having the snow. I wish we had a little bit more snow this winter, but I like winter. I like it a lot.
Yeah, the snow's pretty. I'll give you that.
Yeah, the temperature every day in my greenhouse, as long as it's sunny, is between 62 and 72 degrees. So I kind of like that too.
I love the spring in New England. I'm really looking forward to getting some beautiful spring-like weather here.
And last year we had an outstanding spring.
Yeah, I can't remember that long ago, although we were all kind of indoors for the most part, as I remember.
Right, yes.
Well, speaking of history, on this date in lighthouse history, on March 14th, 1798, Congress appropriated $13,250 for a lighthouse at Eaton's Neck on Long Island, New York. The lighthouse was built quickly and went into service on January 1st, 1799. It's the second oldest lighthouse in New York after Montauk Point Light, which began operation in 1797.
The American photographer Diane Arbus was born in New York City on March 14, 1923. She once said, quote, "You can only grasp the world by action, not contemplation. The hand is the cutting edge of the mind." End quote.
Speaking of really old lighthouses, today's subject is the oldest standing lighthouse in the Western Hemisphere, Sambro Lighthouse in Nova Scotia, Canada. And speaking of grasping something by action, our two guests have taken an active role in the preservation of Sambro Lighthouse. Let's start by telling everyone a little bit more about Sambro Lighthouse and our guests.
The brightly striped red and white tower on Sambro Island near Halifax, Nova Scotia, is the oldest lighthouse in the Americas. The first act passed by the Nova Scotia House of Assembly on October 2, 1758, authorized the lighthouse. It was paid for by a tax on vessels entering Halifax Harbour. The tower stands 82 feet high, and its light is 140 feet above the water.
In its more than 260 years of service, Sambro Lighthouse witnessed many shipwrecks and sea battles. More recently, during both World War I and World War II, German submarines torpedoed a number of Allied vessels near the island.
In 1966, Sambro's old first order Fresnel lens was replaced by a modern rotating DCB aero beacon type light. The original plan was to scrap the old lens, but it was rescued and put on display by the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax. The station was automated and destaffed in 1988.
The Nova Scotia Lighthouse Preservation Society succeeded in having the lighthouse designated as a classified federal heritage building in 1996. 2 years later, the tower was reshingled and repainted. In 2008, more restoration work was completed and a solar power system was installed. Another major restoration project was carried out in 2016. A new local nonprofit organization has also been formed to preserve the lighthouse, the Sambro Island Lighthouse Heritage Society.
Joe Flemming, who lives in Ketch Harbour, Nova Scotia, is a past president of the Nova Scotia Lighthouse Preservation Society, and he has played a large role in the preservation of Sambro Lighthouse. We'll also be hearing today from author and former lighthouse keeper Chris Mills, who is a founding member of the Nova Scotia Lighthouse Preservation Society.
I had a chance a couple of weeks ago to speak with Joe Flemming. Let's listen to that conversation now. I'm speaking today with Joe Flemming in Nova Scotia. Thank you so much for being with me today, Joe.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, you live in the Halifax area, I believe. Is that right, Joe?
Yeah, very near Halifax. I'm actually out in Ketch Harbour, about a kilometer away from Sambro.
I don't know if I've mentioned to you that I have some roots in Nova Scotia, my ancestral roots. My ancestor founded Pubnico on the south coast. And there's actually a couple of lighthouse keepers in my family tree down there. The Abbott's Harbour Lighthouse, which I think is the actual lighthouse, has been moved to a museum, I believe, an Acadian museum. But
Right.
You've, of course, been very involved in the preservation of Sambro Lighthouse. And speaking of connections, I understand you have a family connection to Sambro Island. Can you tell me about that?
Sure. Now, I didn't know about this, through my entire life. It wasn't something that was really known to my family. I had started doing family research, compiling my family tree and looking through records. And I found in a poll tax for the community, and I was looking for my ancestor's name where I knew he had been at least from that area. And as I looked through it, all of a sudden I found his name, but it was in its own little category at the bottom, and it was listed with Matthew Pennell Sr. and Jr. listed at being at the Sambro Island Lighthouse. So that was my first indication that my ancestor had any connection with the lighthouse.
Also, I understand you had some Navy experience, and I'm wondering if that had any influence on your interest in Sambro Island or in lighthouses in general.
Well, it certainly had an influence as far as lighthouses go. I spent a fair amount of time at sea. I didn't spend an entire career at sea, but I spent a lot of days at sea, months at sea. And whenever you're on your way home, one of the things you're always looking for is a sign of home. And, the captain's up there saying, we'll be home in 2 days, 3 days, and you never really believe him. You wonder where they're taking you. And then all of a sudden you see the lighthouse. And I always used to explain how I'd be sipping on a coffee and the sun would be coming up, and all of a sudden you'd see Sambro Lighthouse on the horizon. And you knew you were home when you saw that lighthouse. That was it. There were no more tricks and there was no turning back. We'd all paddle to get home if we had to.
Yeah, lighthouses have that connection for a lot of people. It represents home. So what led to your involvement with the Nova Scotia Lighthouse Preservation Society and specifically the effort to preserve Sambro Lighthouse?
Well, I started to look at the family history connection I had with the lighthouse. And through that research, I came across a Facebook group, which was the Sambro Island Lighthouse Heritage Society, and noticed that they were making efforts to preserve the lighthouse and to try to get it protected. And I thought, you know what? Here's a family connection. I've always loved that lighthouse. Here's an opportunity for me to reach out and see if there's something that I could offer to help. I was in logistics, so I thought maybe through fundraising and things of that nature, I might be able to lend a hand. So I reached out and got in touch with Stephanie Smith and Sue Paul, who were working with the community to do what they could to raise awareness of the lighthouse and its importance. And from there, we formed a wonderful relationship and met lots of great people through there. Barry McDonald, who was the president of the Nova Scotia Lighthouse Preservation Society, and just kind of found a comfortable home where I could work with these people who were very genuine and very hardworking and very much had the same love for lighthouses that I did.
Let's talk about public access to the island. I think that's something that's especially important to you. Is that right?
It is, yes, it is. It's difficult, though. I mean, many lighthouses along the coast of Nova Scotia here, you can get to by land, whether you can drive right up to them, walk to them, hike, but you can get to them. And so they play a role in the tourism in the province. But with Sambro Island and other lighthouses that are on islands nearby, it makes it a little bit more challenging, especially on the open ocean. I mean, the North Atlantic can be a pretty wild place, and it can be sunny as can be, but if the winds are up or there's a storm offshore, it can really make it challenging to get a boat out there. And really hard, too, even just to get people to understand why you've had to cancel a tour. The weather looks beautiful. Why can't we go? But if you took them out and you showed them the size of the seas and the surge inside some of those coves, they might get a better understanding. But it proves difficult and it's challenging, and it's hard to convince even Parks Canada that it's a good idea, because they look at that also. They look at how many days a year could they get somebody out there. And so we're constantly looking for solutions to that, and seeing, okay, well, maybe we need to work with some helicopter tours as well, things of that nature. So it's tough to sell it, but I think no matter how many days you could operate the tours, it's going to be worth it. But it's tough when you're dealing with budgets and you're dealing with different organizations within the federal government and trying to create alliances, with the provincial government and with the city it certainly creates a few roadblocks, I guess you could say.
Well, we have a lot of those same issues with offshore lighthouses in the United States as well, so I totally understand what you're talking about. Let's talk a little bit about the history of Sambro Lighthouse. It's a very long history, obviously. It's my understanding that it's the oldest standing lighthouse tower in the Americas, but it wasn't actually the first lighthouse in Canada, as I understand it. Where was the first one?
The first one was in Louisbourg in Cape Breton. And, unfortunately, it had fire damage prior to Sambro being built. So, of course, it ended up being one of those lighthouses that was the first site of a lighthouse. And as well in North America, Boston Light was actually older as well. But again, it was destroyed and then rebuilt after Sambro was built. So Sambro definitely gets the standing title of oldest operating lighthouse in the Western Hemisphere, I believe. But those two lighthouses at Boston and Louisbourg were certainly older.
Yeah, what was so special about Halifax Harbour that led to the building of that very early lighthouse?
Well, it was one of the first ports and safest ports to be settled here along the Nova Scotia coast. And the British, of course, had this port as a highly strategical port, I guess you could say. The shipwrecks that would happen on the way into port would gain a lot of attention. So it's, at one point they just had to do something to make shipping safer coming in and out of here. Too many ships lost, too much loss of cargo, and far too many lives lost as well.
Let's talk a little bit about the construction of the lighthouse. What is the tower actually made of, and when did it get its distinctive red stripes?
The tower itself is built out of granite blocks. When you walk inside, you can see them, just absolutely massive granite blocks that were, we believe that they were brought from a quarry here near Halifax. And in 1906, 1907, they decided to raise the tower actually up another 22 feet, from 62 feet up to 82 feet. And it was at that time that they put the red stripes on. Because from sea, when you look at this tower, especially during winter, it would kind of blend in with a white background with snow along the shoreline. So they put those red stripes on so that you could really see the difference between the lighthouse and the shore itself.
Over the years, the lighthouse in Halifax Harbour and the area around the lighthouse, there's been a lot of shipwrecks around there. What are some of the most notable shipwrecks there?
The Daniel Steinman, I guess, is probably one of the ones that really comes to mind. The other type of shipwreck that I think of a lot, I mean, you had the Esquimalt as well that was out here, but the Esquimalt wasn't wrecked; it was torpedoed. And one of the reasons why I bring that one up in particular is because during wars, through time, the battles at sea were primarily where a lot of the battles happened that we were able to see from our shores. And because Sambro Lighthouse played such an integral role of getting ships and convoys in and out of Halifax Harbour, a lot of the enemy U-boats and shipping would be waiting in and around Sambro Island. So that's where they knew that these ships had to go in order to get in the harbor. And so they'd lie in wait in that area. And so there were several shipwrecks that were caused actually from the war, not just by hitting the rocks, but, unfortunately that area was known to be safe passage into the harbor. So those enemy U-boats, especially during World War II, would lie in wait there in order to sink some of those ships that were part of those convoys.
Have there been naval battles? I guess the torpedoing of vessels, as you mentioned, is sort of a form of a naval battle, but anything else of note as far as that goes?
Well, there have been several different skirmishes. If you look, I mean, the lighthouse was built during the 7 Years' War. Also, you had the War of 1812, you had the Civil War, Revolutionary War. There's, of course, World War I and World War II. So there have been several sea skirmishes that have taken place off the shores of Sambro Island. And it's hard to really pinpoint any one specific one being more intriguing than the other. World War II, to be honest with you, is the one that intrigues me the most because it's the one that we hear the stories about the most from different families in and around Sambro and Ketch Harbour, and just hearing the actual family connections to some of those stories. It included aircraft as well. I mean, we had aircraft during World War II that would be offshore, and we had one that actually had to ditch and actually had to land in Ketch Harbour, just a couple miles from the lighthouse, because it got lost in the fog, and it was running out of fuel, and it needed a place to touch down. So it actually touched down in the harbor, just not too far from the lighthouse.
Are there any particular stories of lighthouse keepers or families on Sambro Island that really stand out for you?
Well, I like the stories, and you've probably heard my friend Chris Mills mention it in some of his interviews, which is John and Marjorie Fairservice. When they were on the light, and they were out there until the late 80s when it was destaffed, and I heard a story once about how, their children would go to school in Sambro during the winter because it was just too rough and too dangerous to transport back and forth. And I heard about John and Marjorie were actually marooned on a little piece of rock just not far from the lighthouse itself, and John had to actually swim to shore in order to reach out to the Coast Guard to get help in order to come and get Marjorie and bring her safely onto shore. And it's stories like that when I hear about just how tough these people were out there. This was everyday life for them. I mean, they spent over 20 years out there. But that story of the hardship and just the everyday tasks that you and I, think we just need to go to the grocery store or we need to pick something up, we just go and do it. And then I think of the challenges and the danger that you hear in stories like that, and it just humbles you when you think of what they had to go through just to operate daily life in order to keep themselves and their children safe.
Can you remind me how far offshore is Sambro Island?
Well, it's a couple of miles. It's a couple of miles from Bald Rock. It's probably better part of 3 miles if you're coming out from Sambro Harbor itself. So it's certainly within sight, but it's in a very rough part of the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, I was thinking how it's not as remote as a lot of offshore lighthouses, but it might as well have been, I'm sure, especially in the winter.
Absolutely. It's one of those lighthouses where if nature doesn't want you to get to it, it lets you know early and it lets you know hard.
And I also understand that there's some interesting history related to the very first fog signal on Sambro Island. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so early on, when they needed a method of sound signals, the Royal Artillery was stationed out on Sambro Island, and they had 24-pound guns out there. And they would fire those as a method of signaling to ships that the light was there in fog. And early on, Captain Roos was actually one of the first lightkeeper on the island, and he got fired because he didn't keep a very good light. And word has it that ships actually had to fire their cannons in order to wake him up so that he would go up and clean the glass in the gallery so they could see the light as well. So cannons played a large role out there, and oddly enough, 3 of those cannons are still out there today. There's part of a 4th, but it looks like something went horribly awry with the 4th, and it's just in pieces, but it is there. And so the Royal Artillery out there, the cannons firing, and you can just imagine the sound of that booming through the fog to let mariners know where they were.
Let's skip ahead to the more recent history. First of all, I understand the lantern, the actual top of the lighthouse, is not the original one. When and why was a new lantern installed?
Right, so in the 60s, that lantern, it was a first order Fresnel lens, and it's been moved to the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax. There were several different methods of lighting a lantern through the years, using fish oils and then onward to kerosene and then electric, of course. And I think it was just a matter of progression with the times. It was just more efficient, and the technology was on hand to upgrade and to make it less I guess you could say it was less difficult to maintain for the lightkeeper and for the Coast Guard to have to go out and repair it. And so that was in the late 60s that was changed. And but it's also had other beacons since. It's had an airport beacon that was up there at one point, and now it's just a small beacon. You wouldn't think that it could do the job, but you look up there now and it's just a little light bulb with a small lens around it that turns, but it still shines a light.
You mentioned the first order Fresnel lens, and you mentioned that it was moved to the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax. I visited there a little over 20 years ago, and I love the museum. And that lens is kind of a centerpiece, certainly one of the focal points of the museum. As I remember, it was, at least when I was there, it was one of the first things you see when you enter there. I don't know if that's still the case, but
It is.
yeah, it's a great thing that lens has been preserved for people to see.
Well, and what's really quite neat about that, and I heard this story from Chris Mills as well, is that he mentioned how when they first started to take it apart, they were pretty much throwing it over the side. They had no intentions of preserving it. That wasn't the intention. They just wanted it out of there, and they were going to replace it. And somebody stood up and said, "Hey, whoa, wait a second. We need to preserve this. This is history." And so then they switched to a more delicate method of lowering these pieces to the ground. And thank goodness they did, because it's it really is a centerpiece, as you say, of the Maritime Museum. When you walk in there, or even walk on the sidewalk out in front of the building, it shines, out through the window at you out on the sidewalk, and it's stunning.
Yes, it absolutely is. I'd like to shake the hand or maybe hug that person who decided to save that lens rather than trash it. That happened with too many lenses in both our countries.
Absolutely.
What remains on Sambro Island, the light station there, besides the actual lighthouse tower?
Well, right now there is a gas house which is on the island, and the gas house is down below in the cove where they had manufactured acetylene. But there's also a generator building which is up beside the lighthouse, and it's in bad repair, but it's been used as kind of a home base for the different renovations that have been done over the last few years. And so it still stands. It still has a solid foundation, but the roof is weak, and it certainly needs some repair, and it has some historical value of its own, especially the gas house as well. We've done a couple projects out there with our Department of National Defense to try and reinforce it a bit, to try and make it hold on as long as it can until we can come up with a solid plan for preservation. But other than that, the other buildings are gone. Unfortunately, we had one keeper's house that was removed back in the 70s, floated ashore, and that does still exist even today, and that's wonderful. The other one got destroyed by a storm just over the last couple of years, and of course there was one prior to that was set ablaze by vandals. Unfortunately, it's kind of one of those situations where there's nothing left other than those three structures, and there used to be several.
So in 1997, Sambro Island Lighthouse was designated a protected heritage building. What kind of condition was the lighthouse in by that time?
Well, the condition wasn't very good at the time. It really, really needed a paint job. It needed a lot of work done just to get it up to the point where it could be preserved. I think in around the 97 area, it was really in danger of being lost if somebody didn't do something very soon. So thank goodness it did get that protection, and it did get a bit of a facelift at that time.
More substantial restoration work was done a few years ago. That was 2016, I think. Can you describe that work that was done more recently?
Sure. Yeah. So this work was it was one of these packages of work. To be honest, we didn't expect it to be so thorough. We had been advocating for more preservation of the lighthouse. It was in desperate need of a paint job, and so we had been asking our federal counterparts to try and get something done. And Megan Leslie, who was an MP, actually tabled some a bill to try and get this lighthouse with Parks Canada. Unfortunately, an election was called, and we didn't end up getting to that point. However, it wasn't too much longer after that we ended up getting a call from Peter MacKay. The Conservative Party, who was in power at the time, had actually decided to allocate part of the budget to actually getting preservation work done to Sambro Island and Cape Sable. And it was in the tune of several $1 million between the two projects. And so we were quite pleasantly surprised and excited. And DFO shared with us the plans and the extent of what those preservation efforts and restoration efforts would be. And they were thorough. I mean, they had a gentleman who actually, he specialized in doing, I won't say ancient, I guess you could say, but certainly historic stonework. So he was in there with some of his tools, which weren't electric tools, and he was just chipping and pounding away inside this lighthouse and then resurfacing it and preserving it to make it look like it was new. And so by the time they were done, the paint job and fixing the collar and the concrete work around the collar and a lot of the woodwork and windows. It looked like it was almost a new lighthouse. It was absolutely fantastic, but probably the best shape that lighthouse has been in since it was built.
Yeah, I remember seeing pictures after that work. I was pretty impressed. As you mentioned, it's looked great after that job, but I'm sure there's still work that needs to be done. I mean, the work at these places is never actually finished. Once you finish something, there's something else that needs repair. But at this point, what are the major needs for Sambro Island Lighthouse?
I think attention is really the need. Constant attention. As you mentioned, things, as soon as you finish doing restoration work, as soon as you turn your head, things start to deteriorate right away. It is a very much exposed part of the North Atlantic. And so between the sea and the salt and the wind and rain, it starts to take a toll immediately. So although that restoration work that was done in 2016 was certainly welcomed, what we really want to see is a long-term preservation plan. That's what we would like to see. That's what we would like to see the federal government commit to, whether it be through Department of Fisheries and Oceans or Parks Canada. We just want to see that lighthouse preserved like any other historic site in Canada. It's, it was built as a result of the first act passed by our Legislative Assembly when it was first formed in 1758. So it has provincial historic significance, and federal as well, obviously. I mean, it was the first light people saw as they came to Canada from overseas to their new home, a lot of the immigrants and whatnot. So it certainly has significance where there's enough parties involved that I personally think would be able to put together a solid plan for future preservation. But it's a matter of getting people to the table, and there's a lot of other things going on in the world right now, as you well know. So it's tough when the world always has something on the burner to convince somebody that a lighthouse is significant enough to warrant attention.
Well, that's a central problem. A lot of us have historic preservation and lighthouse preservation specifically are not super high on most people's lists, and there are a lot of other good causes, of course, but we agree that preservation is so important. And speaking of that, what has been the role of the Nova Scotia Lighthouse Preservation Society in the restoration and preservation of Sambro Lighthouse?
Well, the Nova Scotia Lighthouse Preservation Society, their primary role is to encourage really a culture of preservation. So it's working with the community groups around the province to try and recognize the importance of their lighthouses and to help community groups establish themselves and get set up with I guess you could say, with business plans and things like that to help better the prospects of preserving their lighthouse. So we don't necessarily do the physical preservation itself, but we help them connect. We help them connect with other communities that have done similar work. We help put them in contact with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to help facilitate sometimes the transfer of ownership of lighthouse properties to some of these community groups. And so that's our main focus is really helping communities network and encouraging that culture of preservation.
And there's also a separate organization, the Sambro Island Lighthouse Heritage Society. And what role does that organization play?
They're more of a community-driven organization. So this is like a grassroots group of people who have family connections and community connections to that lighthouse. And so they have that extra bit of passion that's required to help push some of our political counterparts to do what they can to help preserve that lighthouse. And so that's where you start to learn a lot of the individual stories and the impacts on fishermen and families. And without those community groups like the Sambro Island Heritage Society, it's pretty tough to get anything done without those grassroots community groups.
So we touched on public access earlier to Sambro Island, but I'd like to just talk a little bit more about it. I know this year was different for lighthouses everywhere and for all kinds of tourist attractions and that sort of thing. But if hopefully things get sort of back to normal this coming season, or at least the one after that, if not this one, what is the current status of tours to Sambro Lighthouse? How easy is it for the public to get out there?
Well, right now we operate tours on a couple of days throughout the year, and it takes place during Sou'wester Days, which is a community celebration in Sambro. We've taken some people out on individual tours that are organized through the local charter within the community, but it hasn't been a regular, routine, set tour date type of schedule. And so what we would like to do is we would like to see ourselves get set up so that we can get people out there on a more regular basis. The demand is there. We're certainly seeing it now, especially with people wanting to do more local tourism within our own province, given the situation with COVID around the world. So I think this year might be the opportunity to really capture that opportunity and get people out there, because the local demand is going to be here.
How can people help if they would like to support the ongoing preservation of Sambro Lighthouse?
The best way to support is to make it known to their local MPs that lighthouses in Nova Scotia need to be saved. They are our culture. I mean, if you look at what brings people to Nova Scotia, it's lighthouses and lobsters. That's what brings people here. People love it. The coastline, this beautiful opportunity to be part of the wild North Atlantic and see these structures for what they are. They're absolutely majestic. And so anybody who comes to Nova Scotia, is in Nova Scotia, or just loves lighthouses in general, just voice it to their MPs, voice it to whichever political, affiliated party they have in their community, that, hey, listen, lighthouses are just as important as other historic structures in Canada, and they need to be preserved. And it's really that pressure. It's that knowledge that it is important to people that drives political action.
By the way, I don't know if people listening to this podcast are going to be able to hear this, but my neighbor is shoveling snow out here, so I don't know if that can be heard through my mic or not, but we just had a foot of snow a couple of days ago. You probably got some of that same storm, I would imagine.
We did, yeah. It got pretty wild, actually. The seas right now are pretty angry as a result.
It was pretty wild around here. I'm about a couple miles from Whaleback Lighthouse at the mouth of the Piscataqua River, and the 70-foot lighthouse, and the waves were hitting the rocks and going over the top of the lighthouse during the
Beautiful.
storm. Yeah, it is beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. But back to the support of the lighthouse. If people feel like they want to make some sort of donation, financial donation to the effort, is there a mechanism through which they can do that?
Well, certainly, if they're looking to help out with lighthouses in general, the Nova Scotia Lighthouse Preservation Society has a website that you can go to. It's the nslps.ca, and there's an opportunity there to become a member and donate. So if you're going to donate, you might as well become a member and do it in that way. That way we can keep you up to date, send you newsletters and things of that nature to let you know what community groups are doing around the province to preserve their lighthouses.
I have one final question for you for bonus points. Get ready, because this is going to go on your permanent record, so think hard here. Okay, so what has been your personal favorite part of your involvement with Sambro Lighthouse and, by extension, lighthouse preservation in general?
I think my favorite part of it is the satisfaction of being part of the history of it. And what I mean by that is that we spend a lot of time looking in the history books, in the archives, and reading about the lives of the people who did everything they could, and unfortunately some gave lives, in order to preserve our way of life along the sea. And to know that you yourself are playing a role, and that someday in the future people will, may look back, your own family members, and say, hey, my family took part in helping preserve our culture and our heritage along the shore with these lighthouses. That feels really good. And and I think that's why we all do it. And seeing the look on people's faces when they come and they visit the light. They see pictures, and the pictures are great. Don't get me wrong, they're wonderful. But when you can bring somebody out to one of these lighthouses for the first time and you see their eyes just light up, and you can tell they're humbled. Their knees are probably shaking because of just the feeling, that the majestic view they get when they walk up on those rocks. It's just nothing short of humbling. And the sense of wonder, it's almost like everybody becomes a kid again when they walk in front of one of these lighthouses. And so that's probably one of my favorite feelings when I'm involved in preserving these lighthouses.
Beautifully said. And when I asked that question of various people They almost always touch on the same aspect, the dealing with people visiting the place and having such a great time, also just soaking in the history. Very few places have the tremendous history that Sambro Island has. So, Joe Flemming, I want to thank you so much for spending this time with me today. It's a lot of fun chatting, and I hope we can do it again sometime. There's a lot to talk about with Sambro and the other, preserving the other lighthouses in that area too, which you've been involved with. But Joe Flemming of the Nova Scotia Lighthouse Preservation Society, thank you so much.
It's my absolute pleasure.
Our next guest is a Canadian author and former lighthouse keeper, Chris Mills. Chris is originally from Ontario, but he has lived most of his life in Nova Scotia. Between 1989 and 1997, Chris worked as a lightkeeper at 11 different light stations in 3 provinces on both the east and west coasts of Canada.
Chris was a founding member of the Nova Scotia Lighthouse Preservation Society. He's authored 2 books, Vanishing Lights and Lighthouse Legacies, Stories of Nova Scotia's Lightkeeping Families. Chris was our guest in episode 23 of Lighthearted, and he was also part of the special edition where we discussed the movie The Lighthouse. Let's listen to my recent conversation with Chris Mills now. I'm speaking today with my friend Chris Mills in Nova Scotia. I understand you've been doing a lot of shoveling today, Chris.
Yeah, well, I used to work in radio and wrote a lot, so I shoveled a lot there, and now I'm shoveling the white stuff
right.
Because we do live in the Great White North, and we had a bit of a blizzard overnight in Nova Scotia with 30 to 60 centimeters of snow, which is a foot to 2 feet of snow down last night. So yeah, there was a bit of shoveling this morning.
Yeah. As I said you're doing some shoveling today, I realized that could have a double meaning there. So thank you for clarifying that.
Well, we'll concentrate on the snow part then. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about Sambro Lighthouse today, which I think is one of your favorite places. I know we've talked about it quite a few times over the years. And you have kind of a long personal relationship with Sambro. How far back does that go?
Well, it goes back about 30 plus years. It goes back to 1988 when I was not living in Ketch Harbour as I am now, but Ketch Harbour is about 3 miles as the crow flies from Sambro Island, which is at the southwestern approaches to Halifax Harbour. And I had a chance to get out and see the lightkeepers. I knew the lighthouse was going to be destaffed in March of 1988. And along with lighthouse historian and friend Rip Irwin, I went out to the island for 3 days and spent 3 days in very stormy weather, much like we're having right now, snow, sleet, rain, good foghorn lighthouse weather, and spent 3 days with the keepers there. And that was the beginning of my association with Sambro Light.
Now, that last keeper and his wife, they were there, was it something like 24 years? Is that right?
Bang on. Marjorie and John Fairservice and their daughter Kelly, who was also a lighthouse keeper there, a relief keeper, and she was the final principal keeper there. They had originally gone to the island. John was assistant in 1964. In 1968, he became principal keeper, and he was officially the last full-time principal keeper, with his daughter filling in for him as he and Marjorie were preparing to move their belongings off the island. And the island was destaffed after 230 years of continuous staff status.
Well, we'll get back to talking about the post-destaffing years shortly, but let me just ask you a very general question here. What's so special about Sambro Island and the lighthouse?
Well, Sambro is special for many reasons. It's special because it's a beautiful, wild, semi-remote spot. It's special because of its role in the development and growth of Halifax as a garrison town and as a town and a city that welcomed immigrants, because we processed a lot of immigrants coming from the old world at Pier 21 in Halifax, and it was often the first sight of the new world that immigrants saw. It was also extremely important. Halifax was founded in 1749. Sambro Light was begun in 1758 and completed in 1760, and it was instrumental in not only guiding naval ships in and out of the garrison town of Halifax, but guiding all manner of traffic from lowly fishing vessels to, and I only say that because of their size, to ultimately to ocean liners during the final years when lighthouses were really important in the 1940s and 50s. So it's had a huge role in the growth of Halifax.
So if we could go back to the early history a little bit, what was it like? Sambro was a fairly isolated place. What was life like for the early keepers there?
The position that Sambro Island has always had with relation to the mainland hasn't changed, but back then it would have been much more remote because we didn't have mechanized transport. And now you can get out there, if the weather's good, you can get out there on a jet ski or a kayak in the summertime. It's amazing. But back in the day, there were no roads to this area from Halifax. Everything was done by sea. And of course, weather was a huge factor. And if you were out there, you were basically a prisoner of the island while the weather was bad, especially during this time of year. So for the early keepers, having to do everything manually, of course, with seal and whale oil lights to maintain and cannon and other various explosive fog signals to maintain, as well as getting their provisions there and having their families with them. As you can imagine, without the modern conveniences that we take for granted, life was quite a strenuous affair.
I'm sure it was. I spoke with Joe Flemming a bit about the earliest fog signal at Sambro, which was actually a cannon. And I know you're very into lighthouse history, but you also love the fog signals and the history of the various fog signals. Would you care to comment on the later fog signals at Sambro after the cannon?
I can't give you a definite or definitive chronological list of the fog signals, Jeremy, but I can tell you that there's been a plethora of signals used there, starting with signal cannon, also involving gongs and bells, acetylene fog gun, which I'll talk about in a second, explosive fog signals, a diaphone fog signal, electronic fog signals of 3 types, and now no fog signal, which is a story in itself. Perhaps really interesting, the fact that many Canadian and U.S. and European lighthouses used the Canadian invention, the diaphone, from the early part of the 20th century until the latter part of the 20th century, and in Canada till 2000, actually. The last diaphone was taken out of service. But it wasn't until the 1960s that the Coast Guard installed the diaphone on Sambro Island, or the Department of Transport. But before then, they were actually still using acetylene and explosive charges for fog signal. The acetylene gun looked a bit like a trumpet set on end, and acetylene was used to create an explosion, which created something akin to a cannon shot or a gunshot, and that was used as a fog signal. And in fact, a few years ago, we found parts of this heavy bronze and brass apparatus on the beach, which was part of the acetylene fog gun used from the 1930s up into the 50s or early 60s. And then, of course, the diaphone, which I mentioned. And then with semi-automation in the early 70s, electronic fog signals, then a more powerful electric signal, and then post-solarization, battery-operated horn, which was taken out of service more than a decade ago due to complaints from a local resident. And that's a story in itself.
Thanks for explaining the acetylene gun. I really didn't have much of a picture of how that might work. So that's a fairly unusual thing. The fog cannon was unusual too, but there were a few of those at early light stations in the U.S.
So, of course, at Boston Light, and we had Cross Island on the South Shore had a fog cannon. I believe there was one at Cape Roseway in southwest Nova Scotia, and there were 3, I believe, 24-pounders in use on Sambro Island. Now, a garrison had been established on the island of 3 or 4 soldiers to staff this array of cannon. And the signal, to my understanding, was used not only to pass messages ashore, like one shot followed by a certain amount of time and another shot or 2 signified some sort of vessel traffic of Her Majesty's or His Majesty's naval ships, but it also used in fog as a way of letting the mariner know that Sambro Island was there. And it's an extremely dangerous place, especially in the fog, because it's surrounded by treacherous reefs. There are still 2 complete 24-pounders on the island, and parts of a 3rd and 4th on the island, which is quite astounding. They're still very visible close to the lighthouse.
The fact that they've stayed at Sambro all those years is amazing.
Quite interestingly, I'll just add, Jeremy, that one of them is in several pieces, which begs the question, how powerful was the explosion that blew it apart? Because it's about 6 inches thick cast iron. It's just incredible. So obviously these were dangerous things to use, but they were as effective as technology allowed at the time to act as a warning signal for a Sambro light.
To shift gears a little bit for a few minutes here, I understand Sambro has a ghost story, which of course is something every old lighthouse needs, and and apparently you had your own strange experience there. Could you tell me the usual explanation for the ghost and what your own experience was?
I might précis my story of the ghost by saying that there's a correlation between the amount of rum consumed by lighthouse keepers and fishermen and the amount of haunting on a particular lighthouse.
Uh-huh.
And we'll leave it at that. Now, I wasn't drinking rum when I was on the island and supposedly experienced double Alec or double Alex, but apparently Alexander, known locally in Sambro as Double Alec because of his double-barreled name, was one of the soldiers stationed at the garrison, assumedly to fire that signal cannon. Apparently, as the story goes, he had been sent to town, to Halifax, to gather provisions for his colleagues on the island, and he had taken the money and he had spent it on wine, women, and song, and as the saying goes, and wasted the rest. He came back to the island contrite, got in trouble with his superiors, and apparently hung himself somewhere near the tower. Don't ask me how or what he hung himself from, but apparently his colleagues came upon him, his fellow soldiers, and he was still living, barely, and they wanted to cut him down, but their superior said, no, it is not allowed in this organization, this army, this detachment, whatever it was, and he died. And soon after his death, the hauntings began. And it's interesting to note, I interviewed Minnie Smith, whose grandfather, William Gilkey, was a lightkeeper on the island in the 1870s. She was close to 100 when I interviewed her, and she recalled hearing stories of unknown figures walking around the island back in the 1870s and 1880s that her grandfather would have experienced. Those experiences continued into the 1980s with the Fairservice family. So Double Alec or Double Alex apparently remained on the island right up until the time of its destaffing, and he may well still be there.
So do you feel you've gotten to know him well enough that you can call him Double Al?
I do not. Okay. No, that would cheapen his ghostly presence. I would not call him Double Al.
Sounds too friendly. Yeah,
it sounds a little bit too gauche. But my experience was that during this 1988 mid-March trip, and I was staying in the assistant keeper's house with my friend Rip and the relief assistant lightkeeper Jerry O'Neill. We'd stayed up late talking about lighthouse life and the ghost story and everything else. It was blowing hard. The foghorn was on. The light was on. It was a typical lighthouse night. We all retired to our respective rooms upstairs. And 2 or 3 in the morning, I awoke to the sounds of someone going through charts. We had hauled out some navigational charts the evening before. And someone was apparently going through these charts and moving them. You could hear the paper rustling in the living room. So I thought, well, one of these guys is up and can't sleep, and he's just having a look. So I questioned the other 2 gentlemen the next morning, Rip and Jerry, and no, I wasn't up, and no, I have no idea what was going on. So it wasn't one of those hugely frightening, ghastly, ghostly stories, but it just kind of begs the question, who was up looking through the charts while 3 keepers and visitors were sleeping upstairs on a stormy night on Sambro Island? I'll leave it at that.
Okay. That stirs the imagination, let's say, for sure.
But I will relate one story which occurred to Kelly Fairservice, who was the daughter of John and Marjorie. She had a friend visiting, and her friend was a no-nonsense sort of gal. I believe she worked in the offshore on an oil rig, and she was on her off time, and Kelly had brought her out to visit her family on Sambro Island. The young lady had retired early one night, gone up to Kelly's room, and got into bed. And at some point during the evening, she felt a presence in the room and something very heavy and large laid on top of her. And she was absolutely terrified. She was able to get out of bed and come downstairs and rejoin the family, but she didn't gather enough wits about her, so to speak, to tell Kelly what had happened till the next morning. But it frightened her very badly. And this would have been during the late 70s or early 1980s. So she had a very frightening experience there. And there were all sorts of other less frightening experiences, but it appears that something was happening on Sambro Island.
It does appear that way. That's pretty unnerving to have something or somebody lie on top of you, somebody you can't see. I'll just mention that I've had experiences that lead me to being open-minded about these things, so I don't judge any of this at all. Let's just leave it at that. I should probably,
Absolutely. I don't disbelieve, I don't believe, and I don't disbelieve.
Right. I find myself on that same fence, but I definitely have an open mind about it. Moving ahead a little bit here, well, back to your visit there in 1988 when it was still staffed. Very shortly after you visited there, it was destaffed. What kind of condition was the place in at that time?
John was a lightkeeper's lightkeeper. John kept the place immaculate. And even though they had known that destaffing was looming for several years, it was something that began in the early 70s, and it was just a matter of time. He continued to maintain the site to very high standards. So you would have 2 keepers' houses, which were kept up. You would have had at least two ancillary sheds down by the water, and a boathouse and a boat to maintain, as well as the fog alarm, fog signal, engine room up the hill next to the lighthouse and the light itself. Boardwalks and sets of stairs, the skids for the vessel, the outboard motors for the vessel. Everything was kept in tip-top shape, and everything was painted up. So everything was in excellent shape, and it's quite shocking to look at an aerial view of the station, current aerial view, and then compare it to one taken in the late 70s or early 80s and realize what a glorious, large, well-maintained station it once was.
Between then and now, most of the buildings have been lost, except for the lighthouse tower and I believe a couple of other buildings. Can you just reiterate what remains standing there besides the lighthouse?
Right now, the lighthouse, which has been restored twice and is in very, very good shape inside and out. Next to it is the fog alarm building, which would have contained the engines and compressors for the diaphone, and then laterally the electronic horn equipment, as well as backup generators and a radio beacon and a radio room on the end of the building. That's in very, very poor shape. And the gas house, which is down in one of the 2 landing coves, it was apparently used for the manufacture of acetylene gas, which was used not only in the fog signal, but as I understand it, in the light itself. So it was a building in which acetylene gas was manufactured. Don't ask me about the process, but that is apparently what happened there. That building went through a partial restoration thanks to Rip Irwin, who I've already mentioned, the lighthouse historian, back in the mid-90s, but unfortunately nothing has come of that. Joe Flemming, who you spoke with a little while ago, may have mentioned the fact that some military folks and himself went out and helped shore up the base of this historic gas house a few years ago, but since then nothing has been done. So essentially what's left is the 1758 lighthouse. 3 houses that were once on the station are gone. One was floated ashore in the late 70s and still stands in Sambro as a private residence. One was fell down basically and was demolished by Coast Guard, and the other one was burned to the ground by vandals.
That's sad. So it sounds like there's really nothing in the works as far as preserving the other buildings besides the tower.
There was talk about trying to do something with the fog alarm building, but it's full of asbestos, which is problematic, and it's also reached the point where it would have to be basically a total reconstruction. My hope would be to see the gas house saved. It's a marvelous welcome to the island to come into this granite cleft, basically with deep water, with a beautiful stone foundation in this old wooden fish shed sort of building, a substantial size building at that, with the lighthouse looming over top. It's extremely photogenic, and it's impressive to come in that cove and see that, and it's really part of the scene of Sambro Island when you see it first coming from the southwest. But I don't see anything active happening with that. Happily, the lighthouse is still lit and is in excellent condition inside and out. So that is something. But to me, a light station must be a light station, not just one building, but the ancillary buildings and fog alarm buildings, sheds, and dwellings. And that, to me, is very important for the cohesiveness, the integrity of a site. Unfortunately, that's been lost in North America's oldest operating lighthouse station, and that's very unfortunate.
Do you feel that there's enough support in place to keep the lighthouse preserved for the foreseeable future?
I think because the Coast Guard and the Government of Canada have realized how important the tower is in terms of its heritage, its history, and its part of its role in the history of not only Sambro, but Halifax itself. I believe that that is a tower that will always be maintained. As far as developing the island in an historical sense or context, I don't know if that will ever happen. Joe may have spoken to that with you. He could speak to you more definitively about that. I know there are hopes to make it more visitor friendly. But at this point, I'm of the mind, and I might not find favor with certain lighthouse aficionados by saying this, that it may be although there is decay, there is a nobility in that decay, and at least the lighthouse is in decent shape and it continues to flash its welcome and warning. So it is part of a life cycle of that site, and as such, maybe it should be enjoyed as such.
Should there even be public access to Sambro?
My opinion has evolved as I get older. I'm 56 now, which is not any kind of benchmark, I guess. But my point is that I think in earlier days, I would have thought, yes, it should be restored as it was, as a staff station. It should be rebuilt, it should be maintained, and it should have regular access by visitors. My thought now is that this has been a rather organic process, even though it does include a lot of neglect from the federal government in the past that's let the station come to the stage it is now. But having said that, there is a certain nobility in that tower, as I've mentioned, and the decay around it. I think it should be carefully developed in terms of being stabilized and maintaining the tower and possibly preserving the gas house. I do believe that's important. But I do not believe it should become a tourist mecca. It should not become the equivalent of our Peggy's Cove, which some of your listeners may be familiar with. It's the premier lighthouse site in this part of North America because of its lighthouse and because of its accessibility. Mm-hmm. I don't think that will happen with Sambro. I believe it's important to carefully and sensibly and sensitively have the site available to visitors, but not a wholesale, large-scale development.
Access is important, but it needs to be controlled and needs to be within certain limits for the natural environment of the place and for the health of the stairs and the lighthouse, among other things. So I definitely agree with you that you can't just have wholesale public access at a lot of these places.
At this point, I think careful, well-considered, low-impact development would be important to interpret the site and maintain the lighthouse itself, but not develop it wholesale into a Disneyland, so to speak.
Summing it up, what are your hopes for the future of Sambro Lighthouse?
Sambro Light is just so integral to the history of Halifax and Sambro village itself. Sambro continues to be an active fishing village, a busy one at that. And every fishing boat that leaves Sambro passes on either side of Sambro Light, coming and going. And even though it's not as important as it once was, it is symbolic of the protection it's offered to mariners over the years and of the welcome it's offered to people coming to a new life in a new land. And as such, it's absolutely crucial that that lighthouse be maintained and developed to a point so that people can understand and be proud of what we have in North America's oldest operating lighthouse.
Nicely summed up, my friend. Chris Mills, as always, it's a real pleasure talking with you, whether it's about one of your favorite lighthouses, Sambro, or whether about the movie, The Lighthouse, which is the last thing we chatted about for the podcast.
Yes,
that was fun, too.
And I still haven't gotten over that one.
I think a lot of people would say the same thing about that, for good or for bad. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, thank you, Jeremy. It's a pleasure to talk with you again, and I'm really enjoy talking with you about lighthouses. It's a passion for both of us, and it's a real pleasure.
Thanks again to our guests today, Joe Flemming and Chris Mills. For more on the Nova Scotia Lighthouse Preservation Society, check out their website at www.nslps.com. And the Sambro Island Lighthouse Heritage Society has a Facebook page at www.facebook.com/Sambro Lighthouse.
I've been to Halifax, Nova Scotia, but I've never been out to Sambro Island. I hope I get to do it sometime. It's definitely on my bucket list. And hopefully I'll get to do it with Joe Flemming and/or Chris Mills as my guide. For the next episode of Lighthearted, we'll stay a little closer to home. We'll have an interview with Ken Morton, the owner of Sandy Neck Lighthouse on Cape Cod, Massachusetts.
Many thanks, as always, to the staff, board members, volunteers, and members of the U.S. Lighthouse Society at the Society's headquarters at the Point No Point Light Station in Washington and around the world. To learn more about group tours, the quarterly journal The Keeper's Log, the Lighthouse Passport Program, the J. Candace Clifford Lighthouse Research Catalog, and all the other things the Society has to offer, go to uslhs.org.
If you listen to this podcast using Apple Podcasts or any other app or website that allows listeners to post reviews, please rate and review us. And if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can always email me at jeremy@uslhs.org.
As the young wizard Harry Potter once said, quote, "We've all got both light and dark inside us. What matters is the part we choose to act on." End quote.
As always, thanks for listening, and
keep a good light.
Out in the dark, I'm gonna let it shine. Out in the dark, I'm gonna let it shine. Out in the dark, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine.